Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Thibault Biscahie. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre de Recherche en Droit Public in the Law Faculty at Université de Montréal. We are really thrilled today to welcome Professor Jamie Martin, who is a professor of history and social studies at Harvard University, to discuss his 2022 book, The Meddlers: Sovereignty, Empire, and the Birth of Global Economic Governance. This is a very important book that explores how inchoate yet pivotal international institutions managed to impose austerity, independent central banking, and various regulations that made older practices acceptable after World War I. Professor Martin is a historian of political economy and empire, and he has published widely for scholarly and public audiences, including in the International History Review and the Historical Journal, as well as in the New York Times and the London Review of Books. He's currently working on a book project on the global economic consequences of the First World War, especially beyond the principal theaters of conflict in Europe and the Middle East. Today's lecture by Professor Martin inaugurates the lecture series or cycle Origins and Structures of Global Economic Governance, which is a bilingual lecture series that will span from early December 2023 to early April 2024. Before briefly introducing the purposes of this lecture series, I would like to warmly thank Professor Karim Benyeklef, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, for enthusiastically supporting holding the organization of this exciting event. I would like to also thank Alexis Leblanc-Roy for all his help with the planning and preparation of the series. The aim of the Origins and Structures of Global Economic Governance series is to critically explore the history and practices of public and private institutions associated with the governance of the global political economy. So what is economic governance exactly? By economic governance, we generally understand the norms, the policies, the activities aimed at ensuring macroeconomic, fiscal, and monetary performance. But this seemingly neutral and overly concise definition begs a much larger question. Economic performance, sure, but for whom and for what? For now, let me please answer this question by another question and invoke the mother of international political economy, London School of Economics Professor Susan Strange, and the ways in which she defined economic power in the international system. In 1975, Susan Strange published an article in the International Journal entitled, bluntly entitled, "What is economic power and who has it?" This was an old question, of course, but it was a question that became more perplexing and worrisome for Western industrialized nations in the context of the 1973 oil crisis. We were in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, and the world, and in particular Western industrialized economies, was faced with petroleum shortages and elevated prices as a result of the proclamation by OPEC of an oil embargo in response to the US decision to resupply the Israeli military. For Strange, this question was not just an academic one. It was one that was, I quote, relevant to many of the great issues concerning the future prospects for humankind and human society. This important question will therefore be at the heart of this lecture series. Let us keep in mind, as Susan Strange reminds us, that the international system is not just dominated by relations between states. As the international economy grew even more interdependent, the greatest threat to the autonomy and integrity of states is not the threat of an external aggression by another state. She says that it is rather the subtle, silent, and insidious permeation of national societies by transnational actors. And these transnational actors can be either public or private. Power in the international system is, of course, relational. It can be derived from a military relationship, a military alliance, for instance, or from an ideological relationship, as we saw during the Cold War with the phenomenon of alignment. Yet, Susan Strange argues, power is first and foremost derived from the economic relationships, the relationships between buyer and seller, between producer and processor and consumer, employer and employee, and of course, and this is the main theme of Jamie Martin's book, between lender and borrower. This set of economic relationships underlined by Susan Strange shapes the working of the capitalist system. a capitalist system that is deeply cyclical and strongly crisis-prone. Therefore, the governance of that system, its rules of operations, its governing structures, is best understood in the longue durée. And the merits of the longue durée perspective are precisely what Jamie Martin's books allows us to appreciate, as it traces the origins of institutionalized foreign interference to the end of World War I and not to the end of World War II, as the myth of the Bretton Woods Conference as a revolutionary watershed moment for international relations too frequently suggests. With the help of an enormous amount of archival documentation, Jamie Martin thus undertakes a fascinating inquiry into the historical roots of political and economic interference in the first half of the 20th century. And now I don't want to say too much about the content of the book. Let me just say that it offers a captivating panorama that generally helps us reconceptualize the birth and contours of global economic governance. And as such, it fosters really important debates about the politics of development, both historically and in the contemporary era. I'm once again delighted that such a fascinating book inaugurates this lecture series. Thank you again for joining us, Jamie, and looking forward to hearing you talk.
Well, thank you so much for the very kind invitation to be here, and thank you to those who are joining us by Zoom. It is a great pleasure to be back in Montreal and to be among you and to inaugurate this very, very exciting lecture series. So thank you, Thibault, for that very, very kind introduction indeed. So what I'll do today is to talk about the arguments of my book, The Meddlers, Sovereignty, Empire, and the Birth of Global Economic Governance, which, as Thibault mentioned, was published in 2022 by Harvard University Press. So essentially, what The Meddlers aims to do is to offer a political history of the rise of the first international institutions to govern the world economy. A process that I date to the end of the First World War, or really to the final phases of the First World War, and not to the conclusion of the Second World War. The book shows how these institutions, as they began to emerge, yes, no problem.
Sorry.
The book shows how these international institutions essentially reshaped old tools of empire to a new era of self-determination, and how in the process these institutions found themselves pit into very, very fierce political struggles with a broad array of actors, political parties of the left and the right in many different countries, bankers and businesses in the United States and Europe and Europe's colonies, nationalist movements from China to the Balkans and elsewhere. But gradually, what I show is that these institutions were able to oversee a radical and dramatic transformation in international governance, essentially by cracking open domestic spaces of economic management and political economy to the reach of powerful external actors. So what I'll do today is to essentially offer you an overview of one of the stories that my book tells. And in doing so, my aim is to give you a new perspective on the deep origins of institutions that exist today, like the International Monetary Fund, and the way in which the predecessors of these institutions first emerged out of efforts to reshape the relationship of empire and the world economy in the aftermath of the First World War. I also will give you a sense, I hope, of just how intense the political conflicts were that this process of reconfiguration involved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open with a context that I assume will be familiar to many of you gathered here in the room and online. By the turn of the 21st century, international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had come to wield extraordinary influence over the domestic economies and economic policies of states around the world. By attaching conditions to their loans, these institutions were able to oversee and insist on programs of austerity, deregulation, privatization, trade liberalization in many, many places. The so-called golden straitjacket of policies that was supposed to be conducive to economic prosperity, global integration, and so on. Now, there's a common story about how these institutions developed such interventionist powers in the late 20th century as they were wielded for a kind of process of Washington consensus global transformation. This narrative begins with the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, where representatives of over 40 countries met to reshape a world economy that had been devastated by depression and by war. And in the act of creating the IMF and the World Bank, the idea was that these representatives at Bretton Woods were seeking to recreate a world economic system that simultaneously allowed states to exercise more control over their national economies, right? The idea was that they were trying to make a kind of a return to some form of global economic integration compatible with the unfurling of new domestic macroeconomic and welfare policies, right? The idea that a compromise, one of the great compromises of the mid-20th century is being reached, that a kind of moderate form of globalization is to be made compatible with the New Deal in Keynesian states. But according to this narrative, this compromise, as extraordinary as it may have been, was rather short-lived. And the Bretton Woods system, after it breaks down in the early 1970s, creates a conundrum for these institutions that were created then. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they've lost their original mandates as the Bretton Woods system itself is buried. And so these institutions begin to be mobilized for a very different project. And in particular, they're used to enforce neoliberal policies, particularly in the former communist bloc after the end of the Cold War, and then, of course, as well in the global South. So as these institutions begin to develop these new agendas, they become very unpopular, right? And they're denounced around the world as meddlers. They're accused of bullying states into pursuing very painful domestic reforms, often against the wishes of their citizens. Now, it's often claimed that the problems of sovereignty and of democratic and economic self-governance that were posed by institutions like the IMF first originated in this period of late 20th century globalization, a period during which neoliberal policy ideas are on the ascendant in the wake of the Cold War and during the process of transition of many formerly socialist states to capitalism and so on and so forth. The idea that this kind of challenge to sovereignty posed by a very powerful international financial institution is somehow an innovation of this late 20th century moment. But as I show in my book, these problems actually are much older and they date to a much earlier era. And that in fact, it was at the end of the First World War that international economic institutions began really for the first time in history to reach deeply into the domestic economic policies and institutions of sovereign states. See here an image from the late 1990s in Korea, protesters protesting the terms of financial assistance for the country, essentially using this very powerful language of the IMF, essentially reducing Korea to a financial colony. And as I'll demonstrate, the lineage and of this kind of accusation of powerful international institutions transforming the recipients of loans into colonies or semi-colonies is very, very, very old indeed. And there's reasons why we want to take these charges seriously, not only as metaphors, but because of the precise, deep imperial histories of the way in which this kind of financial power has long been leveraged. So the aim of these very first original international economic institutions was, in short, to stabilize a European-dominated international order and to defend liberal capitalism in an age of extremes. The powers of this first wave of international institutions were shaped primarily according to the interests of a few European governments and banks, primarily from the Allied powers that had won the First World War, and particularly from the United Kingdom, the British Empire. A handful of US financial institutions and occasionally US public authorities also played a role in the genesis of these institutions. The most important of these institutions, as you can see on this slide, was the League of Nations. But over the interwar period, the League of Nations was also joined by the Bank for International Settlements, various intergovernmental bodies that regulated commodity prices, and other institutions. Now, what I refer to as the first wave of international economic institution building, it's something that for a long time was neglected. And in large part, this is because of the dominance of a series of narratives about the interwar period, about the failure of institutions like the League to deal with the worst of the Depression, to prevent the coming of war, and so on and so forth. Now, in recent years, several scholars, have rescued the economic functions of the League of Nations from obscurity, really building on a wave of scholarship that really attempted to refocus our understanding of the interwar period and the innovations that were made in governance during this period that would ramify very powerfully after the Second World War, tracing lines that had been neglected, linking the 1920s and even the 1930s to the 1950s and beyond. Now, what I demonstrate in my book was that the League of Nations and the kind of experiment that the League's economic governance represented was actually one of several overlapping attempts, really, to bring new international control over the world economy. And really, the focus of the book is to look at how this first wave of international economic institutions all faced a new political challenge, and how they sought to overcome this political challenge. And what was this political challenge? It was the idea that domestic economic policies, domestic fiscal and monetary policies, trade policies, and so on and so forth, could not become the object of external intervention, right? The idea that these were to be the exclusive domain of sovereign states. And if a powerful and muscular international economic institution were to emerge, then it would have to somehow break down this taboo, right? It would have to somehow convince states to allow some kind of involvement of these external actors in these realms that were coded as domestic. And the attempt to break down this taboo, which over time proved very successful indeed, really represented an attempt to oversee quite a seismic innovation in international order, something that was akin, I argue, to the human rights revolution, right? Which similarly involved a kind of rethinking of the borders of the domestic and the international, though in this case, when it came to the question of how nationals could be treated, right? Now, the history of human rights has generated an ocean of scholarship. But this analogous question about economic governance hasn't been given the same treatment, right? How could you turn the fiscal policies of a sovereign state into the object of international governance and concern? Now, in describing this transformation, what I'm going to try to show you today is how this first wave of international economic institutions, far from being failures, developed actually an extraordinary set of powers. Even when these institutions fell short of some of their most ambitious aims, they essentially gave rise to a series of powers that remain with us today, right? They should all be familiar with us today. So, for example, the first time that an international institution ever enforced a program of austerity on the ground was in successor states to the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires in the 1920s. The first time an international body ever oversaw investments in the economic development of a member state was in 1920s Greece. Now, this was not to build up Greek industry, but instead was to deal with the enormous economic challenges that Greece faced following the influx of over 1 million refugees following the 1923 population exchange with Turkey. The first experiment in using an international body to control commodity prices in the way that OPEC does with oil today, or at least to regulate commodity prices, was in Southeast Asian colonies of the British and Dutch empires in the 1930s. So again, all of these kind of mechanisms that we know well from the operation of global economic governance today have actually very, very old lineages indeed. And again, as this new set of international institutions attempted to innovate these powers, they all wrestled with this new problem of politics. Could the domestic economic policies of sovereign states be open to external intervention, but in ways that would be considered legitimate practices of international cooperation and not simply new forms of outright coercion and imperial bullying? Now, the interwar period was not the first time that governments and businesses had cooperated for the sake of promoting international commerce. And certainly this was not the first time that some states had pressured others into relinquishing control over their policies, their assets, their institutions and laws, and so on. What was so radically new after the First World War was the idea that you could ask a state to relinquish its economic sovereignty to an international institution that claimed to represent its interests, right? And that granted formal membership to the state in question. This was supposed to represent a new kind of partnership that would ameliorate the potentially coercive aspects of the demands this institution might make on a member state. But the emergence of this potential kind of partnership, let's say, posed, again, a very profound challenge to deeply rooted norms of international law and diplomacy. The idea that formal sovereignty protected a set of domestic policies from the reach of outside actors. And by the end of the 19th century, the kind of list of policies that would be coded as domestic included taxation, public spending, perhaps above all else, trade policy and tariffs, questions about whether a government subsidized domestic industries, questions about natural resources, and so on. Now, big caveat, this idea that formal sovereignty was supposed to protect this kind of insulated domestic sphere of economic policy only applied to certain states, right? Few countries outside of Europe and the United States had ever enjoyed such a robust right to economic non-interference. Of course, this right had never applied in practices to places that had been brought under colonial rule, that had been subjected to semi-colonial financial controls, that had been faced with the removal of their ability to set their own tariffs, and so on. Banks and the empires that often protected their interests had long before the First World War perfected the art of meddling in the affairs of others without needing to formally colonize them, right? And the list of such states is very long. China is perhaps the kind of foremost example. The Ottoman Empire, states in the Caribbean and in Central America all faced various forms of semi-colonial restrictions on their economic autonomy without ever formally losing their sovereignty, right? But what I demonstrate in the book is that it was precisely these precedents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that made the attempt to innovate this kind of proto-global economic governance so profoundly controversial. In this extraordinarily hierarchical and imperial global order, how could any state allow external actors to have access to these internal realms without in the process admitting to a loss of autonomy, power, and prestige that was tantamount to admitting a kind of semi-colonial status, right? That you were kind of welcoming your demotion on this kind of league table of global hierarchies. So what I argue is that one of the principal kind of functions and aims of this first wave of international economic institutions was to attempt to make some of these older imperial practices more compatible with the legal fiction of sovereign equality, and importantly, with a new mass politics of self-determination. They were designed in ways that were supposed to make it easier for states to accept the demands of powerful foreign actors, particularly in this case, that of powerful British and American banks, the Bank of England, the British Empire, and so on. They were designed to make states more likely to accept these kind of interventions by redescribing them, in some cases by masking them, and kind of providing a way of mediating the relationship of states to powerful foreign financial institutions in ways that was supposed to somehow bring down the temperature on what could be very explosive politics surrounding economic intervention. This is an image of the governor of the Bank of England and his wife. In this case, he's hiding behind his hands, I believe, to kind of shield himself from photographs of a kind of paparazzi of his day. But this image, in a certain sense, puts into concrete form what Norman and some of his colleagues understood the promise of institutions like the League of Nations and its financial committee could be, that it would provide a kind of mediating layer between banks and a recipient of their loans that would somehow make the explosive politics around the demands of these bankers more tolerable for the sovereign state, right? So he's kind of masking himself here. But over time, kind of despite what contemporaries recognized were these explosive politics, these institutions managed to turn a once almost unthinkable practice of international governance into a routine one. Over time, it became common for these institutions to have access to these realms of domestic fiscal, monetary, and later trade policy, and to do so in ways that could be claimed to be distinct from older practices of empire and gunboat diplomacy. Okay, so that's a kind of introduction to the kind of shape of the argument of the book, or one of the major arguments of the book. Now I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about what I mean here and try to convince you that this was, in fact, what was going on. So I'll speak about one particular aspect of this story, a very important aspect concerning the rise of conditional loans, essentially. First, for the sake of financial stabilization, premised on fiscal austerity, and second, for the sake of economic development, or something that looks very much like economic development as we know it today. And then I'll conclude by bringing us back to more familiar terrain with the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions in the 1940s. Okay, so we're going to start again with the League of Nations. So when the League was established in 1920, it was endowed with very, very weak economic powers. The League's covenant was written in a way that seemed to rule out any actual significant role for it in dealing with policies like tariffs or public finance. At best, the League of Nations in its economic capacities appeared to be something like a kind of glorified international public union of the kind that had existed in the 19th century. It could be useful to encourage a kind of a return to commerce. It could be used to standardize various measurements and so on and so forth, collect data. But basically, it was designed to be toothless and to avoid controversy. But there was an obvious problem with the kind of compatibility of the vision of more ambitious economic internationalists with this kind of initial suspicion that the League couldn't get involved seriously with economic questions. There was a problem, which was that if you were to attempt to govern a highly interdependent world economy, and the world economy still was highly interdependent, absolutely, despite the strains that the First World War had placed on the world economy. The idea was that if you were to try to govern an interdependent world economy, you couldn't only focus on the relationship between states, right? It also seemed like you had to develop some kind of leverage over domestic policies, right? The decisions made on a domestic level could ramify internationally. So how do you get access to those domestic arenas of decision making? So this kind of mismatch between the aims of some ambitious economic internationalists and the legal limits that were placed on the League at its birth actually, and quite surprisingly, were overcome fairly quickly, in fact. By the early 1920s, the League of Nations Financial Committee had developed unprecedented powers of economic intervention. Unprecedented, certainly, at any kind of international institution. But it had developed these powers only in application to a few select places. And primarily, these places were new states created at the end of the First World War in Europe, out of the ashes of old empires, and in states that had lost the First World War. And this is a very important detail. So what happened? So the early 1920s is a very financially unstable time. The world economy is kind of lurching from inflationary crisis to deflationary crises to inflationary crises and back again. In many states, particularly in new states in Europe, the early 1920s is a period in which hyperinflation is very common. The Weimar Republic is kind of the most famous place, but in many other states, indeed, hyperinflation has kind of reared its head, right? And at the time, there's a standard playbook for arresting inflation, one that's not too distinct from that today. Get central banks to raise interest rates, remove them from democratic control if they're not already independent, slash public spending on civil servants, on benefits, and so on and so forth. And in this context, also get currencies back onto the gold standard. But in countries facing serious political instability just after a major war, implementing these policies was very difficult, right? How do you get a government to slash spending on veterans? How do you get a government to actually cut spending on the military in the aftermath of global war, so on and so forth? And what was even more outlandish was to think that you could endow this new and untested international institution with the authority to tell a state how to spend its money, right? Again, there's almost nothing more political that you can imagine. How do you tax citizens and how do you spend money? Could you really somehow endow an international institution with the power and clout to tell a government how to do so? What was extraordinary was that the League did develop this power. And the way that it did so was primarily in a series of negotiations with states and financial institutions over the terms that private banks would insist on in order to make financial stabilization loans to European states undergoing such extreme financial instability. And what happens essentially is that the League of Nations Financial Committee comes to play this mediating role where they appoint advisors to the governments and central banks of these states in receipt of these loans in order to exercise powers of veto over decision making, right? So if you want the money from the bank in order to stabilize your finances, then you need to agree to fire civil servants. You need to agree to remove a kind of key decisions about fiscal and monetary policy from the reach of parliaments and so on and so forth. And the idea here essentially is to make these very financially unstable states attractive to lenders. And the way that they would become attractive to lenders was only if they lost their full sovereignty, essentially. The basic logic of this practice, that there's a kind of trade-off between creditworthiness and sovereignty, was much older than this point. Before the First World War, many states in search of loans had been pressured to relinquish their full sovereignty to representatives of their creditors, often with outright threats of violence. This had involved the establishment of foreign debt commissions. Here's an image as well of kind of League, an international financial conference organized by the League in 1920. So before the First World War, many states, again, that had sought out foreign capital had been pressured by lenders to agree to the establishment of these kinds of these foreign debt commissions in places like you can see here, the Ottoman Empire, places in North Africa, states throughout the Balkans, the Caribbean, Central America, and so on and so forth. And essentially, and I'm generalizing a bit here because these institutions were distinct, and the Chinese Maritime Customs Service was even more different. But generalizing roughly here, essentially these institutions work by removing domestic control over sources of public revenue, and in some cases over economic policy making. And from the perspective of lenders, they tended to work as they were intended. Countries that were put under this kind of semi-colonial financial control were considered less risky borrowers, and they tended to enjoy lower interest rates as a result. But as you can imagine, wherever these institutions were created, they generated enormous resistance because of what they represented, right? They represented a clear and kind of humiliating loss of control over some of the most vital and political questions of policymaking, right? How do you tax? How do you spend money? How do you deal with public assets and resources and so on and so forth? Now, if you are a lender in the context of 1920s Europe, looking out over a map of these very, very unstable states desperate for foreign capital to stabilize their finances, if you're a banker, you look and you think, well, we have this precedent from the 19th century. We know how to get what we think to be very, very risky borrowers to do what we want. And we know how to turn them into what we believe to be less risky borrowers. But what this involves is the creation of some kind of semi-colonial institution within their borders. Can we really do this in Europe as well? Can we really bring states like Austria or Hungary or Poland under this kind of foreign financial control. Now, from the vantage point of the bankers, actually, it wasn't that controversial. When the money's on the line, they thought, fine, this is what this would necessitate. But to other contemporary observers at the League of Nations and elsewhere, the prospect of establishing Ottoman or Chinese-style debt commissions in European capitals like Vienna appeared to pose a major threat to perceived civilizational hierarchies and kind of a way of doing business, let's say, in Europe. And this was where the League of Nations was supposed to come in, right? As this multilateral and supposedly politically neutral institution, the League of Nations was supposed to now mediate the relationship of these financially unstable states to their private creditors in ways that was supposed to keep both parties happy. So from the vantage point of the banks, the League would place this advisor into the interior of the borrowing state to exercise veto power over domestic policy making to ensure that a state committed to austerity and so on and so forth. And for the borrowing state, you weren't simply inviting in representatives of foreign banks to do so directly, right? You weren't relinquishing control, say, to JP Morgan. You were delegating some authority to an institution in which you had membership, right? And this fact that you were a member of the institution and voluntarily delegating, as opposed to essentially being invaded, this was supposed to make this arrangement less insulting and more kind of politically tolerable, right? So the League of Nations in this way was supposed to function as a kind of legitimation machine, right? You kind of get this unpopular and coercive practice, you kind of put it into the machine, and at the other end, you get something like voluntary delegation that is supposed to not be politically controversial. You kind of take these old tools of European and US informal empire, and you kind of run them through the wash, and out they come as practices of cooperation that would be considered legitimate. But there's little illusion that this is a very, very explosive proposition. Never before this point had there ever been any kind of international cooperation that had been premised on such intrusive demands. And the first time this was attempted, it provoked fierce opposition. This was the Commissioner General that the League of Nations appointed in Austria. But I'm actually going to talk about a different case right now, which is Albania. And Albania was one of the League's most anomalous member states. And it was the first place, I argue, where you see anything like an international financial stabilization loan of the kind that the IMF would later perfect. So just very briefly on Albania, it achieves independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1913. It faces invasion during the war, and post-war Albania is under constant threat by its neighboring states, very unstable politically and financially. And of course, from the vantage point of kind of the Allied powers and the League of Nations, the last thing you want in the early 1920s is for the Balkans to descend into chaos, right? So the Albanian government approaches the League of Nations for help in 1922, essentially asking the League for assistance in stabilizing its finances and attracting development loans to develop Albania's considerable resource wealth. And so League officials see this as an opportunity to experiment. If they could work within the bounds of this very anomalous member state, they might actually be able to demonstrate to other states that the League of Nations financial assistance wasn't threatening, that it was something that other states might want. The problem is that for everyone involved, the colonial precedents to what this work would involve were obvious. They were glaringly obvious. And in fact, as League officials searched for an advisor that they could employ in Albania, they only considered applicants that had had prior experience in the colonial administrations of the British and Dutch empires. They kind of make this a requirement on the CVs of the people who apply. And they very explicitly, behind closed doors, described Albania as only a quasi-European state, as very, very economically underdeveloped, and as a kind of state that could only be governed in this case, by a foreign advisor that had colonial experience. And the person they ultimately hire for this work is a former colonial official from the Dutch East Indies, a man named Jan Hunger, who'd been decided on, again, in large part because of this experience. When he arrived at Albania, though, Hunger found, in fact, that advising a sovereign parliamentary government was much more difficult than working in Java, where he had been able to count on the full coercive powers of the Dutch colonial government. And when Hunger demanded a far-reaching program of austerity, including the abolition entirely of the Albanian military, the Albanian government claimed he was illegitimately meddling in the country's domestic affairs. So it quickly became clear to League officials that they had a problem on their hands. And there's a certain amount of, I mean, it's almost hard to piece back together this decision-making process because it seems to have been quite naive, right? They search out for someone with colonial experience. They then empower him for this job. And then when he arrives, he finds that he's very, very unpopular. And they think, oh no, actually, we need to handle the political optics of it because it's now quite serious. If we mismanage this, we set a very bad precedent. And Albania is a newly independent country, right? The politics of self-determination in a newly independent country after the First World War are incredibly powerful, and they have real mobilizing force, right? So even in a state recognized to be so anomalous, League officials realize they need to act in a way that doesn't appear as though they're browbeating this government. And they attempt to repair the relationship, but the advisor is forced out of the country. And in fact, when a revolution breaks out in Albania that empowers the Orthodox Bishop Fanoli, one of the in the summer of 1924, one of the rallying cries of some of the popular resistance to the prior regime was that it had hired so many foreign advisors, right? So you've got this kind of nightmare scenario from the vantage point of the League of Nations on their hands. They're trying to innovate this new style of powerful financial governance by empowering this foreign advisor in a kind of an experiment in Albania, and it backfires completely. So what's the stakes of this? I mean, the stakes, I think, are very important, right? This is the first time ever that an international body had attempted to make a kind of conditional loan, right? A conditional loan premised on austerity or something like that in a sovereign member state. And it had ended in a major backlash. Now, just shortly thereafter, though, the League does end up having more success on its terms with a larger scheme of financial stabilization. And this was in Austria, which was another unstable republic carved out of another collapsed empire, and one that was facing extreme conditions of hyperinflation in the early 1920s. So stabilizing Austria was seen to be a very, very important project indeed from the vantage point of League officials, to prevent the collapse of the peace settlement, to prevent forces within Austria that wanted to merge Austria with Germany, which from the French vantage point was extremely dangerous proposition, and also to halt the potential spread of Bolshevism westwards, right? And so what the League would attempt to do in Austria, the kind of, the financial stabilization in the service of political stabilization, was similar to what it had attempted in Albania. It would empower a foreign advisor in Vienna that could veto decisions about spending, about taxation, remove the central bank from democratic control, and oversee a huge dismissal of government employees, as well as the slashing of welfare benefits and subsidies. And these plans importantly involved preventing the Austrian parliament from having any means of kind of stopping them. And the idea is really to kind of neutralize, essentially, the challenge posed by social democratic opposition to the reactionary conservative government in power, which at that time was led by this gentleman here on the right, Ignaz Seipel, who was actually a Catholic prelate. You can see kind of wearing the outfit of a church, of a priest. And this was why he agreed to this intervention in the first place, right? Recognizing that this would involve a kind of humiliating relinquishment of sovereignty of this newly sovereign Austrian Republic, nonetheless clearly would be useful for him to oversee financial stabilization policies that his social democratic opposition wouldn't agree to, right? He's using this outside intervention to sidestep his opponents at home, which of course would become a very, very common use for later IMF conditional loans as well, right? That you call on the authority of an outside body in order to neutralize your domestic opponents. But what I want to emphasize here is that the kind of relinquishment of Austria's sovereignty that Thibault agreed to at this moment kicked off a political firestorm in Austria and elsewhere. Even though Austria was a defeated central power, it was still widely considered throughout Europe to be a quote unquote highly developed seat of Western Christendom. And it was true, certainly true in the early 1920s, that the question of which countries could expect to enjoy full economic sovereignty was still widely coded in these kinds of civilizational terms, religious terms, racial terms, and so on. And in Austria, in the kind of realms of popular politics, certainly, both right and left factions described what the League of Nations was attempting to do at this point by appointing this advisor, this foreign advisor with veto powers, was that the League was threatening to Ottomanize the Republic or Tunisize. It's hard to pronounce, but as you can see here on this slide, right? What do they mean by this, right? And why were these metaphors so powerful? They were saying that were Austria to agree to the terms of this loan, that it would be in the eyes of the world reducing its status to that of a 19th century borrower that had been so humiliated by its foreign creditors, right? That Austria would become a kind of Tunis, right? And the metaphor is very, very widely used. In fact, it's so widely used that you see American newspapers at the time reporting this fact that in Austria, everyone's talking about the threat of the Republic being Ottomanized, right? Of losing the status that Austria was supposed to deserve by dint of its European history, and now facing the kind of financial tutelage that before this point was supposed to be reserved for states in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans, and so on. And League officials take these charges very seriously. Again, they insisted that the whole point of their arrangement and their organization was to make something that in practice they admitted was very similar to this more acceptable to a sovereign European state. And again, because the League of Nations offered formal membership, because it offered avenues for consultation with national representatives and so on, it was supposed to make this kind of meddling less offensive than what British and French bankers had done in North Africa and Asia and elsewhere earlier. But the archival record is very clear. League officials closely studied the models of the Ottoman and Egyptian public debt commissions, the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, and various other arrangements that American banks had developed in the Caribbean and Central America. And they understood very clearly the political risks of adapting these kinds of institutions to a newly independent republic in Europe. And again, they explicitly describe their role here as acting as a screen, that they were to kind of mediate the relationship of a state and its lenders, and to do so in a subtle way. The League was supposed to make the extraction of revenue in the external setting of internal policy more kind of subtle, and to do so in a way that would make it less likely to lead literally to rioting in the streets. They worried about actual mass uprisings if their scheme of lending was too closely associated with that developed by private banks in these other places in the 19th century, in part because some of these schemes had led to uprisings, such as in Egypt in the 1880s. Now, while the scheme that the League of Nations did develop for Austria was widely denounced by both left and right in Austria for turning the country into a kind of financial colony, and remember back to that earlier slide from the late 1990s in Korea, accusing the IMF of turning Korea into a financial colony. Well, this is precisely what both right and left factions were saying in Austria in the 1920s as well. But while these accusations are powerful, the League of Nations scheme was on its own terms something of a success, let's say. Nearly 100,000 government employees are dismissed. A new central bank is removed from democratic control and established. The currency was stabilized. And interwar Austria has a very, very painful history indeed, but nonetheless, by the mid-1920s, it appeared as though some degree of financial stabilization was achieved in this state, and the League of Nations officials themselves declare their job successfully over, that they achieved what they wanted. And for a long time, in fact, observers then and later would hold up what the League of Nations Financial Committee managed to achieve in Austria as actually one of the most remarkable successes of the institution, full stop. From the vantage point of the 1940s, looking back over the League, recognizing that it had failed to prevent the coming of the Second World War, some liberal internationalists nonetheless insisted that this was a remarkable success. At the same time, political elites and legal experts, this is an image of kind of a campaign poster of social democratic opponents to the sitting conservative Christian social government, showing the word. You can't see the full image here, but the word on the side of this kind of cart is the German word that was used for Seipel's program of austerity, right? That kind of the workers are pulling along and being crushed, and that's Seipel himself whipping him. Behind him, there's also a picture, kind of a caricature of an American. Again, kind of seeing how austerity mediating by foreign U.S. finance is coming at the expense of Austrian workers. So at the time, there's this recognition that what the League is doing here, it was unclear what the prospects and meaning of it were. Was this a new kind of internationalism? Was this a kind of a promising way that a new international institution had managed the financial stabilization of a member state and had done so in a way that didn't involve something like an Ottoman Public Debt Commission? Or was the League simply laundering empire, right? Was it simply just kind of redescribing in quite formal legalistic terms an arrangement that was recognizably old school and coercive? I think it's a very interesting quote from the Indian social scientist Vinay Kumar Sarkar, kind of an outside observer looking at what was happening. And it shows a kind of a common view from the time, right? The kind of point of this quote is to say that the League of Nations was doing something, but it was not an unmixed blessing, right? And that what's key about this quote is to say that the kind of trade-off that Austria was facing was precisely a kind of trade-off that other states outside of Europe had long faced, right? China, Turkey, countries in South America. Now Austria is to be added to the list, right? It was the first European country outside the Balkans to face the kind of meddling that these other non-European states were long accustomed to. And this interestingly becomes a kind of a view that's articulated by political elites all over the world, from China to West Africa to Latin America. The idea that what Austria is facing in this case was something that they were familiar with, and that the only reason why Austria was now added to this list of non-European states was because it had lost the war. And by losing the war, it's demoted in status down to the level in this kind of perceived hierarchy of states. So again, I want to highlight the stakes of this idea. What you see here is that the first real peacetime experiment in global economic governance as we know it, truly, that didn't involve simply collecting data or standardizing measurements, but actually doing something muscular, right? The first experiment during times of peace turned out to be something that most states didn't want, and that they would desperately seek to avoid, even if they were undergoing conditions of extreme economic turmoil. But again, the kind of defenders of the League of Nations held up this practice and its kind of realization in Austria as an enormous success. And in the short run, it inspired other conditional lending schemes. And I'm going to turn now to quite a different context and really talk about how a very similar kind of style of lending was put into the service of a very different project, what I think of as really the first real economic development loan. Now, international development is generally seen as something that originates during the Cold War as a US innovation under the Truman administration that was first put into multilateral form at the World Bank. But as I show in my book, the first kind of real experiment in using an international body to oversee foreign investments in a scheme of economic development was in 1920s Greece. And again, the aim here is not to build up Greek heavy industry, but instead to finance a huge program of agricultural resettlement for over 1 million Greek Orthodox refugees from Turkey. You can see here an image of them, of some of them. And this scheme also involves some kind of small scale kind of loans for small scale manufacturing, but primarily it's a scheme of kind of a massive agricultural resettlement and development. Now, as many other scholars have shown, the 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey inaugurated a new and brutal practice of dealing with minority populations, and one that would have many further applications after this point, perhaps best known on the partition of India later. But what I show in my book is that the refugee crisis did not only lead to these kind of legal innovations and practices in dealing with refugees and minority populations and so on, but also would give rise to what I think has to be seen as the first development lending scheme overseen by an international institution. To settle the refugees, the League arranged a loan largely from British and US banks that was made conditional on the establishment of a foreign-run commission in Greece. The commission was removed from all democratic control and authorized to oversee how every drachma of the loan was spent, right? It has complete control over the money. And what this involves was this commission being endowed with incredible economic power over the economic lives of what amounted to around 1/3 of the total Greek population at this point. The commission oversaw the construction of houses, bridges, and roads. It oversaw the provision of land, livestock, agricultural machinery to thousands and thousands of families. And the idea was to settle this population of refugees into work that would over time allow them to repay Greece's foreign creditors, right? And this is a very, very key component of this scheme, was that the debt itself was supposed to be self-liquidating. Over time, as the refugees were settled into productive work, as they generated a surplus, this surplus would then be taken to pay off the loan. And in a certain way, the entire financial circuit is supposed to evade the control of the Greek state. And in the process, the Greek economy was to be revitalized by turning it into a major producer and exporter of crops like tobacco and wheat. Now, like the Austrian scheme, the interference this involved in Greek domestic affairs led to fierce opposition. At several moments, the Greek government attacked the commission, particularly after the military coup of the self-styled Mussolini-like figure Theodoros Pangalos in the summer of 1925. Critics challenged the autonomy of this commission at every turn, calling it an illegitimate state within a state. And interestingly, the most powerful of these critics were actually representatives of the refugees themselves, who were deeply integrated into complex political machines throughout areas of refugee settlement in Greece. And for the League, the nature of mass democracy in Greece and the role, the kind of unique role played by the refugees in coalitional politics in post-war Greeks made it that much more necessary to ensure that the Greek government never had any say over these loans and how they were spent. And whenever the Greek government attempted to take the money or kind of interfere with how the money was spent, sometimes even by arresting the employees of this commission, the League of Nations warned the Greek government and the kind of the bankers the League worked with, warned the government in no uncertain terms that if it were to interfere with how the money was spent, that Greece's credit would be destroyed. That Greece would no longer be able to get future loans, right? So the autonomy of this commission operating within Greece had to be preserved at all costs, and any threats to it could have the effect of destroying Greece's credit, right? And it's a very powerful threat to make, right? Now, there's nothing new, again, about the representatives of foreign bondholders eroding the autonomy of states for the sake of protecting investments. And this wasn't even true in Greece, right? Already for decades, as I showed you a few slides ago, Greece had already had a foreign financial commission operating in Greece since the late 19th century, controlling Greek assets and policies, and so on and so forth. But what was the radical novelty of this scheme in the 1920s was that the League of Nations was to be doing it, right? The institution had taken control over this kind of vital, let's say, sector of the Greek economy, had developed incredible powers to intervene in the economic lives of huge numbers of Greek citizens, but it was doing it now in a member state, right? And this membership, again, is held up as this kind of formal legal distinction that makes these powers supposedly legitimate and non-coercive. And at the same time, these kind of the kind of power that's being exercised in this case was actually much more far-reaching than anything that the Greek state had ever faced before. This commission was dictating when and whether refugees could sell their livestock. The livestock that they're kind of leased are branded actually on their bodies as the property, essentially, of foreign creditors, right? The commission is monitoring the productivity of women weavers in the small-scale workshops that are being set up. And ultimately, the League has the final say over the collection of rent, evictions, and even the prospect of imprisonment for those who could not or would not reimburse the commission, this League commission, for the costs of their settlement, right? And League officials recognize that were this commission, this foreign-run commission, to start demanding the imprisonment and the eviction of people who did not pay back the loans, that they might in fact spark a revolution in Greece, right? So again, there's a very clear-eyed awareness of how explosive the politics around this were. But again, whenever the Greek government did anything to hinder the work of this commission, League officials and the bankers they worked very closely with warned Athens that any interference would destroy Greece's credit. Now, again, League officials celebrated the Greek scheme as a resounding success, like the Austrian scheme before it. And this population was, by and large, settled into work, right? But by the late 1920s, again, there's a kind of a recognition among political elites around the world that these practices were dangerous. And even countries desperate for foreign capital by the late 1920s now are desperate to avoid League control. And these countries include China, Liberia, Portugal, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and others. Despite the fact that they have a clear interest in attracting foreign loans, they don't want to become the next Austria or the next Greece, right? And you see this very explicitly as touch points when, for example, Chinese nationalist officials are in conversation with foreign bankers and League officials, and they say, of course, the Chinese state is interested in attracting foreign loans, but you can't expect us to agree to the kind of treatment that was given to Austria and Greece and so on. And as one state after another turns away from Geneva, League officials and the bankers they worked with were, by the late 1920s, essentially forced to admit that these practices were too unpopular to continue. But they didn't go away for very long. And now I'm going to bring us up to more familiar contexts and to argue to you that the emergence of these practices in the 1920s ended up actually, they ended up having incredible staying power, even though they were temporarily put into abeyance during the 1930s and early 1940s. So by the late 1940s, they're already beginning to reemerge. Okay, so let's come back now to Bretton Woods, to kind of terrain again that I think will be more familiar to many people, certainly in a series on global economic governance. So in the first part of my talk, I spoke about how this League of Nations that was dominated, not exclusively, but dominated to a large degree by the British Empire, by British financial institutions, made conditional loans to vanquished and semi-sovereign states like Greece and Europe. Now, what I'm going to talk about is how, as kind of this process of hegemonic transition from the British to the Americans accelerates in the 1940s, how a US-dominated IMF develops quite similar powers and begins over the post-war period to apply these powers more widely. So how did this happen? Now, as soon as plans for a new international monetary institution begin in the 1940s, there's a very, very difficult question that the designers of this institution are forced to wrestle with. Would this new international monetary institution be able to reach into domestic policies concerning budgets, concerning monetary policy, and so on? It becomes a huge topic of controversy. And this fact is often overlooked, or at least not given enough attention, in accounts of the coming of Bretton Woods and the efforts of John Maynard Keynes and his US counterpart, Harry Dexter White, pictured here. As the details of this new international monetary institution, which of course would become the IMF, were finalized in the months leading up to the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, there was in fact great confusion and uncertainty about what exactly the institution would be able to do when it came to its members' domestic fiscal and monetary policies. Everyone basically agreed on what the aim of this new institution was to be. It was to prevent competitive currency devaluations. It was to oversee this new fixed but adjustable exchange rate regime, provide capital to states facing short-term balance of payments difficulties, and so on and so forth. In a certain way, ultimately, that became uncontroversial. But there's a major unresolved question. What could the IMF do when its member states were doing things on the domestic level that appeared to be destabilizing this international arrangement? And in providing capital to member states, could this institution monitor their domestic policies and ultimately tell them what they could and couldn't do, just like the League had done in the 1920s? Now, from the vantage point of Wall Street, there was an obvious answer to this. The IMF had to do this. If it made US capital available to foreign governments, it had to have the authority to tell them what they could and couldn't do with it, right? The idea that you make US capital available to a foreign government that could, say, spend it on welfare or spend it on rearmament or spend it on policies that somehow hurt US strategic or economic interests seemed laughable to the extreme to representatives of Wall Street. And in fact, when Wall Street thought that the IMF would not develop these powers, they opposed the Bretton Woods agreements fiercely. And I think this is something that doesn't often get remembered well enough, that the fiercest opponents to Bretton Woods, really the most powerful opponents, were Wall Street. But US officials and Treasury officials, at a moment at which the US state is, under the Roosevelt administration, distancing itself from Wall Street, the US Treasury needs to convince its British counterparts that the IMF would not prevent the creation of a post-war British welfare state. And the stakes of this become much more pressing when the original blueprints designed by Keynes for an international monetary institution were rejected in favor of US plans, which put much more kind of predominant voting power, in fact, veto power, in the hands of Washington. And Keynes begins to get very nervous that not only is this institution clearly going to be dominated by Washington, but if it were to develop these kind of meddlesome powers, what Keynes refers to as grandmotherly powers, using a very kind of old-fashioned metaphor here, if this US-dominated fund were to develop these meddling powers, then it could kind of deploy them willy-nilly, right? And to do so in ways that would prevent the US from ever facing the same kind of power, right? That an asymmetric kind of intervention was going to be built into the institution from the beginning. And Keynes gets very, very nervous about this. But eventually he is reassured enough, at least, to tell his colleagues that this new IMF would not get involved in members' domestic fiscal and monetary decision-making. And what's very interesting is that if you look at the kind of archival record of the conversations in the British Treasury and the British state at this time, is that Keynes's colleagues are similarly anxious that an IMF with this power dominated by the US would treat the United Kingdom itself as a kind of target of US dollar diplomacy. Now, remember, from the first part of my talk, I described to you how so many European states looked at this British-dominated League of Nations and described its threat with metaphors of Anglo-French financial imperialism from the 19th century, right? From North Africa, from China, Ottomanization, right? And what you see happening in the 1940s is that British officials now look at the prospect of this kind of meddlesome IMF and think that what they're facing is the prospect of being treated by the United States in the way that the US had long treated Latin American states. And they say this. In fact, they say, are you thinking, to their US counterparts, are you thinking of designing this interventionist fund that can intervene anywhere? Or is this just supposed to be for Latin American countries, right? So, the idea is that, maybe it would be acceptable if it were only for Latin America, but you cannot treat the United Kingdom as if it's this quote unquote irresponsible Latin American borrower, right? So again, these kind of metaphors from empire and trying to figure out where you are on this kind of league table of hierarchies returns at this moment very powerfully. Now, in the end, Keynes's reassurance and the ambiguities built into the IMF's Articles of Agreement allow U.S. Congress and British Parliament to ratify the Bretton Woods plans. And as other scholars have demonstrated, the profound ambiguities in the IMF's Articles of Agreement were clearly necessary in order to get this thing passed at all, right? In these different legislative bodies. You need something that appeals to the British Labour Party, that appeases the concerns of opponents in the US Congress, something that might even convince the Soviets to join. So it has to be quite a vague document. And there were guardrails in the IMF's constitution that were supposed to prevent it from weighing in on what were referred to as social and political policies of member states. But there's enormous uncertainty about what this means. Is this about welfare policies? Is this about labor laws? What exactly is this? There's no unambiguous right granted to every member state. And after the agreement was ratified, it actually didn't really matter what the precise text of the Constitution said because of the disproportionate power wielded by U.S. representatives, who kind of seized on the ambiguities in the text to push for the evolution of the institution's powers in ways that reflected U.S. interests, changing coalitional politics within the United States, the kind of return of Wall Street's influence, and so on and so forth. So just a few years after the Second World War, the IMF develops precisely the powers that Keynes had so feared and that Wall Street had insisted on, right? Now dollars would not be provided, at least not to everyone, without conditions attached. Access to capital would not be automatic. And that's what Keynes had always insisted on, was on automaticity. And that is thrown away very shortly after the war ends. And what you see happening is that over the 1950s, the kind of beginning of the reemergence of this kind of conditionality provides more and more leverage for the IMF to target the domestic fiscal and monetary policies of its members. But just like in earlier instances, these powers were always unevenly and differentially deployed. This kind of returned version of conditionality is first primarily developed and brought to bear on borrowers in Latin America and South America in particular. And as you see here from the 1970s onwards, the scope of conditional lending was dramatically expanded. So what I've hoped to show you today is how the IMF at this moment was not playing out a script entirely new to the neoliberal era, right? That there's a very kind of long backstory and the return of dynamics that are rooted in much earlier contexts, right? The IMF is trying to do here what international economic institutions had always done since they first appeared in 1918. They're trying to make it easier for some states to accept the bitter pill of external intervention in their internal affairs. And this is, at this point, a very popular kind of description of what the value of the IMF is to Washington, right? That it makes it more tolerable for states to kind of accept the terms that are favorable to U.S. interests. It's easier than simply bullying states directly from Washington or New York. Okay. So what are the big takeaway points? I know I've covered a lot of ground here, from Albania to Austria to Washington and beyond. One major point here is that I think we should see the origins of global economic governance and the kind of politics that it involved at the moment of its birth after the First World War as representing a moment in which older practices of informal empire were, at the very least, redescribed and tinkered with slightly to make them more legitimate, given the political constraints of this new era of self-determination, at which so many new states were being born. Instead of banks simply kind of taking over these states, as was common in the 19th century, let's say, broadly speaking here, now you have this new set of actors, this new kind of ecosystem of actors, these international institutions that will mediate this relationship between a sovereign state and powerful foreign creditors. And this act of mediation was supposed to make what was clearly recognizable as old practices of empire more compatible with formal legal sovereignty, and importantly, perhaps even more importantly, with the mass politics of self-determination. This legitimation function provided a useful tool for the aims of the British Empire and then later the United States. Second, the birth of global economic governance involved a dramatic transformation of sovereignty in the politics of sovereignty. It allowed outside institutions, in fact, to reach more deeply than ever before, even more deeply than this older era of informal empire, into the domestic policies and institutions of sovereign states. And this represented, as I've argued, a profound challenge to long-standing conceptions of what sovereignty was supposed to provide when it came to matters like public finance, tariffs, and so on. And again, I'd like to suggest that this transformation of sovereignty that begins at this moment was one of the most important innovations in international order in the 20th century, full stop. It's akin in certain key ways to the birth of the first real human rights regime. But these kinds of powers and interventions were never seen as being applicable to all states. And the same is absolutely true, right, with an international human rights regime, where the human rights violations of some governments are to be objects of international concerns, and human rights issues in other states are not to be, right? The same is the case. This kind of asymmetry is absolutely at the heart of global economic governance from the moment it appears, right? These kinds of interventions are always limited to particular kinds of states. Newly independent states, post-colonial states, states that had recently lost a war, right? It's a kind of quote unquote victor's justice in certain ways. States that had long histories of burdened sovereignty and histories of semi-colonization. Third, this meant that this kind of governance would never become some kind of universal form of international cooperation. It made clear, by contrast, that in a deeply hierarchical world, formal sovereignty didn't mean the same thing to every state, right? And it never provided all states with the same degree of autonomy. As had always been the case, only some states could expect their legal status to actually provide them to a real right to non-interference in the economic realm. And I'll leave you with one big kind of takeaway point that maybe we can speak more about in Q&A, and that kind of many people who have commented on my book have kind of latched onto as one of the kind of, let's say, more provocative arguments of the book, is that I think that this kind of longer history should really make us to rethink how we understand, in particular, the international economic order after the Second World War. The idea that this order embodied principles of embedded liberalism, that it was only at this moment that states could kind of enjoy the fruits of globalization while preserving the autonomy to experiment with welfarism and Keynesianism and so on and so forth. I think that this description of the world at this moment is inadequate, as I hope my story makes clear. This kind of arrangement never was universal. It never applied to most of the world. At best, it applied to a small handful of states in the North Atlantic, largely states that were closely intertwined with US security arrangements and so on and so forth. Already by the end of the 1940s, the IMF was using its leverage to get some member states to commit to painful policies precisely of the kind that Keynes had sought to banish, and precisely of the kind that were supposed to not have been deployed during the era of embedded liberalism. And ultimately, I think this kind of original asymmetry that this kind of governance was born with, emerging out of a world of empire of the 19th century, ultimately remains with it to this day. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Martin, for a fascinating discussion of the book. We'll now have a quick discussion, just a few questions that I have prepared to maybe further expand on some of the points that you have mentioned in your presentation. My first question is regards the League, and in particular, the discrepancy that we can see between the League's actions and its reputation. Its reputation is often that of innocuous, harmless, naive, organization that failed to prevent World War II, that was basically too idealistic. And in fact, we discover in your book that it had an enormous role, not only in providing, the economic research, in collecting a lot of data, and therefore in providing the intellectual groundwork for future transformations, but also this sustenance of this myth of sovereign equality, this economic status, this ambiguous economic status with the financial committee. So how do you explain this discrepancy between the League's action and its reputation? And why was the pivotal role played by the Leagues downplayed for so long?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So you already see by the 1940s this emerging consensus, let's say, that the League of Nations was, in its most grand ambitions, a failure. And the way in which this plays out, that's very significant, I think, is that among a kind of coterie of liberal internationalists trying to create new institutions for the post-Second World War international order, is that there is an attempt to downplay the influence that the League of Nations, in fact, is having on the creation of these new institutions. That in a certain way, if you want to convince people that the institution you're trying to design will actually function in this very, very dangerous world, the last thing you want to do is draw attention to precedents of the League of Nations, right? You can see documentation, even where, personnel and kind of boxes of papers and even, furniture is literally being moved from the League, let's say, the United Nations. There's this effort to kind of downplay a story of continuity because of what was clearly a plausible interpretation of the League, if you understood the role of the League as kind of first and foremost preventing the coming of another world war. Well, on that measure, it was a failure, clearly. However, as a whole host of scholars have shown, really building on a very important article written by the historian Susan Peterson, that if you actually focus on the so-called technical functions of the League of Nations, that it managed to do a lot of things. And it managed to do a lot of things that at the time mattered, and that certainly seen over time were originary in key and important ways. Now, building on that insight, several people, including myself, have now kind of attempted to go back and figure out what the significance of the League's work in the economic and financial realms were. It's harder to tell a story of the League of Nations building at that moment kind of muscular power over trade. So the trade story, I think, has to kind of wait for a later period. But in the realm of finance, in the realm of kind of mediating loans, whether for the sake of stabilization or whether for the sake of development, I think a very, very powerful story can indeed be told. And one that in the 1940s, again, behind closed doors, people understood and were looking to. Another problem is that the history of interwar Europe and the kind of international history of the interwar period has long focused so heavily on the question of when did war become inevitable, at what moment was Europe stabilized, how did the decisions made at the end of the First World War make the coming of the Second World War more or less likely, that many of these other innovations of this period that don't pertain directly to that question were overlooked. But I would say that my book is simply one of a growing number of books to try to paint the dots leading from the interwar period to the post-war period in different ways.
So you mentioned the fact that trade was not so much developed at the time in terms of these mechanisms, but finance was very much. And we can look at the financial committee, I guess, of the League. Would you say that it was fully dominated by the British, or was there some insight from other countries as well to direct operations?
There absolutely was involvement of other players, no question. The French, absolutely. Now, the U.S. government, as is well known, the U.S. Congress rejects the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S. government never joins the League of Nations. So at the kind of intergovernmental level, Washington is not playing a role in these arrangements. However, U.S. banks are playing a very, very important role. And in fact, some of the loan capital that's mobilized for these schemes of financial stabilization is coming from American financial institutions. But at the kind of level, at the kind of intergovernmental level, the most significant players are the British and the French, but they're by no means the only ones. Several other states are involved, and by and large, the financial experts that are mobilized to actually kind of serve these quote-unquote in-country roles in Austria or Hungary or Albania or elsewhere tended to come not from Britain and France, in part because of how powerful these states were, that if an advisor were placed into a state that was British or French, this would be seen kind of clearly at the time as just the kind of, the exercise of British or French strategic power, right? And kind of, moving chessboards around a peace in post-war Europe. Instead, these advisors tended to come from the Netherlands, for example, which had formerly been neutral during the war, or actually from the United States as well. So it's not that the British are kind of designing the financial committee completely without the input of other states. But it was clear that at the time, the British finance and state had kind of disproportionate power in the financial committee. And it's something that the French get increasingly angry and resentful about by the end of the 1920s. And that's another important reason why this kind of early conditionality and this kind of early financial stabilization loans are put on ice by the end of the 1920s because of Franco-British competition. In a sense among the French that the British are kind of trying to use these stabilization loans for the sake of broader British strategic aims.
Well, to stay on this topic of European powers, actually one of the, I have a question also about European integration, because some of the, in many respects, your book is telling the story of the restructuring of empires and of the birth of a new kind of intergovernmentalism. And this entailed notably the creation of new technocratic, bureaucratic, transnational class in a way, with like experts meeting in different countries, from different countries. You employ the term of bankers' diplomacy, and all this has also played a big role in the constitution of the EU. Well, first of obviously the CA and then the ECC. And of course, there's the figure of Jean Monnet, who is ubiquitous in the League and will also be ubiquitous for European integration. So how did this first wave of international institution building inform European integration and European economic governance?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the book is primarily focused on telling a larger kind of backstory to the emergence of this kind of, let's say, Anglo-American dominated arrangements in the 20th century and the post-Second World War period. And so it doesn't focus as centrally on explaining post-45 institutional arrangements within continental Europe, which of course would ultimately involve the UK as well. But there are important kind of origin stories here too, as you've intuited. In a certain sense, the whole kind of notion of technocratic internationalism or kind of intergovernmental cooperation upon which the European Union and the project of European integration was based is really kind of emerging out of this interwar milieu. And not just among the actors that I'm speaking about, although I think the actors I'm speaking about ultimately are the ones that have the most power during this period in putting this kind of technocratic, bureaucratic internationalism into practice in ways that kind of ramifies on the ground. But there's a kind of a whole host of various proposals and mobilization and excitement around the possibility of European integration. And it becomes very popular with kind of different kind of factions of differing ideological orientation. For example, it becomes very, very popular among French socialists in the 1920s. And one kind of institutional embodiment of this, or at least an institution that's seen as potentially embodying this, is the Bank for International Settlements. And in the book, I describe the origins of the Bank for International Settlements and how there is this kind of unlikely source of support for it emanating from the French left, who see the bank as providing the possibility of a kind of financial skeleton, let's say, for a future European political union. Of course, that's not what the BIS evolves into. With hindsight, we might think that there's a certain amount of naivete on the part of the French left that this would be possible, but it's a very popular idea at the time. Now, you mentioned one kind of figure who straddles this era very clearly, and that's Jean Monnet. The book opens with a kind of arrival of Jean Monnet at a very, very young age into a position of incredible authority over the creation of these kind of proto-ad hoc institutions of intergovernmental cooperation during the First World War to coordinate and systematize allied economic cooperation. And that really kind of come into their own at the end of the war. Monet himself then goes on to play a very important role early in the League. He doesn't stick around for that long, but he always kind of continues to pop up, kind of, arriving at key moments during the interwar period in China, in the United States, and elsewhere. And then, of course, Jean Monnet becomes one of the kind of leading figures of post-war European integration. Now, there's one way in which I don't want to tell a story, however, of very kind of clear continuity, however, because I do think that the kind of emergence of many of the early bodies of the kind of European Union project are not kind of directly emerging out of this interwar milieu that I described in the book, which is focused much more on finance than it is on, say, the creation of customs unions or on the negotiation of tariffs and kind of, the production of steel and coal and this kind of thing. So these early institutions, I think, are, their lineage to, say, the financial committee of the League. I think that story of continuity is not very direct at all. However, I do think, again, that you're seeing certain kind of practices and institutions emerge at this interwar moment that would ramify in later embodiments of the European project. So, for example, the idea of the European Central Bank as kind of having this anomalous status of being politically independent, but of kind of, existing, or I guess the question of its jurisdiction is very controversial, but kind of, existing in a certain way kind of beyond or above member states. There's a way in which when the Bank for International Settlements was created, this was the key question about its nature. It was to be an international institution, but one that was to be very, very strictly divorced from political control, a kind of meeting house for central banks that had to be independent. And we see this in a certain way, I think, kind of, playing out in the ECB as well. The way in which the European Union developed practices of conditional lending, obviously that emerges out of this earlier kind of milieu. The partnerships that the EU has formed with the IMF, kind of most notably in the Troika, clearly that's related to the story. But the 50s story of European integration is very, very complex and is really building from many strands, some of which come through my story, but many of which come, I think, through kind of orthogonal sources.
Right. Well, it's really this depoliticizing filter in a way that's similar in both cases. When the League's loans were used as buffers to impose policies that national governments were too reluctant to impose. And in the case of the EU, we can see that in a sense too, with some directives being there to take the lead for governments who are too not popular or not stable enough to do so, right?
Well, maybe let me say this, that during this interwar period, there is a quest among many different actors to achieve kinds of intergovernmental bureaucratic arrangements that can achieve technocratic ends that were depoliticized. And in fact, this is when the word depoliticized begins to be used for the first time in different languages, right? So this is an aim that I think that's shared by many different actors. Part of what I'm trying to do in my book is to show when this is actually, when it works. when this broadly shared desire is actually instantiated in a way that plays out in actual kind of muscular forms on the ground.
Right, right. I have one last question, which is mostly about race and the notion of civilization and how they relate to these new international financial schemes. Because we know that in the late 19th century, scientific racist theories were used to justify, legitimize the claims of civilizational hierarchy and developmental status. And obviously, what was implicit here is that the territories where people deemed inferior were living in had very limited sovereignty, and this had financial implications. So we had this specific racist imaginary mobilized to inform the degree of sovereignty, the degree of economic encroachment that was permitted. And after World War I, things seem to change a little bit. We have Wilson 14 points. Everyone is sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others. But the radical change, really, that's really underlined in your book, that the League brought to the fore was that it deeply challenged this logic of civilizational hierarchy inherited from empire. Because one of the first countries, as you pointed out, that experienced deep interference was Austria. So how do you think this meddling, how these activities from these institutions challenged the established racial and civilizational hierarchies of the time?
So I think that you're right to say that there's this moment in the aftermath of the First World War where the question of civilizational status is kind of thrown a bit into turmoil by the conditions created by the end of the First World War. But I think I actually wouldn't agree with the statement that the League of Nations kind of radically unsettles older notions of civilizational hierarchy. Now, in the 19th century and in the years before the First World War, there are many, many states that enjoy formal legal sovereignty, but in ways that do not translate into full autonomy and kind of full right to non-interference from the intervention of external actors. And among many international legal experts and diplomats and kind of political leaders and so on and so forth, the degree of autonomy in practice that a sovereign state is kind of expected to enjoy is almost always coded in terms of this imagined kind of set of civilizational hierarchies. And these hierarchies are sometimes coded in kind of explicitly racial terms. They're often coded, certainly in an earlier era, they're often coded in kind of confessional terms. They're encoded according to religion. They're also encoded, I think, according to the kind of history of sovereignty that a state has enjoyed. So if a state, regardless of its religious orientation, for example, has kind of always faced some kind of burdened sovereignty, then you can get away with kind of, interfering in that state more easily.
Greece would be the typical.
In Greece is the perfect example of that, right? Now, so when the League of Nations brings these kinds of conditional lending schemes to somewhere like Albania, the question of civilization isn't really unsettled because, again, as I mentioned, League officials regard Albania as semi-civilized, right? And it's a state that's confessionally very divided between Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims, for example. So it doesn't. The question, though, of course, of Austria is where this kind of quote-unquote civilizational problem is wrestled with. And Austria, of course, doesn't have this history of burdened sovereignty. Austria, it's kind of, as I mentioned, is kind of regarded as a kind of a major seat traditionally of Western Christendom and kind of very highly established civilization, right? It's the home of Mozart, right? So the idea is, what are the political stakes of adapting these kinds of mechanisms formerly reserved for states, quote unquote, lower on the civilizational kind of hierarchies for this one that, even though it's weak, even though it's unstable, it's at the kind of the imagined pinnacle. And the way that this question is kind of got around at this moment is because is by dint of the fact that Austria chose the wrong side in the war and it lost. And if you look at where these kinds of conditional lending schemes are developed outside of Greece, it's basically only in states that were defeated. Austria, Hungary, of course, both formerly part of the Habsburg Empire, successor states, Bulgaria, Germany, not through the League, but through other kind of related practices concerning reparations and so on. And this is something, again, that these observers outside of Europe recognize. And they say, well, why is it that Austria is now kind of demoted in status to something like a Greece or an Ottoman Empire or a Tunis? And the reason it is because it lost the war. In the late 1920s, Portugal is undergoing extreme financial instability, for example. And there's a moment at which Portuguese political elites reach out to the League of Nations for assistance. And the League of Nations officials arrive and they say, well, if you want our assistance, you have to do this and you have to do that. And Portuguese officials reject it entirely. And one of the rhetorical moves they make in rejecting the degree of conditionality that is to come with this financial stabilization loan is by saying, we fought on the side of the Allies. We are a developed democratic state with a massive colonial empire, and we fought on the side of the Allies. So you can't do this to us. Maybe you could do it to Austria, but you can't do it to us. But the broader point is to emphasize as well that despite the fact that these civilizational hierarchies are kind of thrown into some kind of uncertainty and turmoil at this moment in the kind of very explosive post-war years of Europe, that over the long term, they might change a little bit here and there, but they never go away, right? And I kind of conclude one of the kind of points I make in the conclusion of the book is that much, much, much later, when the IMF kind of returns to Europe, in Greece, to deal with the kind of Eurozone crisis and the aftermath of the global financial crisis and so on and so forth, is that many people in Europe regard this as, again, kind of only acceptable in Greece. But the IMF is not to be kind of, eagerly welcomed back to the rest of Western Europe, because as Sarkozy himself says at the time, the IMF is not for Europe. Right? It doesn't do that. It doesn't do what it does to us. It does it to others.
Although historically with Britain, it's kind of...
with Britain, it's a trickier question. But at the time, when the IMF in the 70s makes its loans to the Labour government, which I was telling, the British observers are saying the same thing. And they say, the degree of conditionality that you're imposing on us should not be acceptable for a quote-unquote advanced state like the British. But it is deployed at that moment. But it's anomalous.
Great. Thank you so much.